Only one of me and my sister was allowed to exist at once. My parents always said they'd only wanted one daughter. So when my sister Ruby and I popped out as twins, they decided to test which of us deserved to exist. They created the challenge system, and every month announced a different trial. Sometimes physical, who could run farther without collapsing. Sometimes it was academic, whoever scored higher on tests they'd written. Sometimes psychological, who could go longest without crying while they said horrible things to us. The winner got everything for the next month. A bedroom, hot meals, clean clothes, school attendance, their parents' acknowledgement. The loser moved to the shed out back with a sleeping bag and a list of chores. During Ruby's winning months, I cleaned the house, cooked their meals, washed their clothes, all while being treated like I didn't exist. I'd serve dinner to my own family while they talked about their only daughters, achievements, never acknowledging the girl refilling their water glasses. During my winning months, Ruby did the same. I'd catch glimpses of her through windows, hauling trash or scrubbing floors, and feel sick with guilt even as I enjoyed sleeping in a real bed. We weren't allowed to talk to each other except for the 5 minutes before each competition when we'd strategize, making sure neither of us lost too badly. We learned to throw challenges subtly, taking turns winning to share the misery equally. By the time we were 15, we'd perfected our system. Ruby was naturally smarter, so she'd help me study for academic challenges through notes left in the shed. I was stronger, so I'd leave training schedules for her hidden in the garden. Then one month they announced a pain tolerance test. We'd stand with our hands on a hot stove burner, and whoever pulled away first lost. Ruby and I looked at each other in horror. We'd thrown challenges before, but this could cause permanent damage. That night, she snuck to the shed and we made a pact. We'd both pull our hands away at exactly the same time, forcing a tie. When the moment came, we stood side by side at the stove. Dad turned on the burners. The heat built slowly. I watched Ruby's face contort, tears streaming down both our cheeks. At 10 seconds, we nodded at each other and yanked our hands away simultaneously. "It's a tie," I gasped, cradling my blistered palm. Mom's face twisted with rage. "There are no ties," she said. "You'll go again. Higher heat." That's when Ruby did something I'll never forget. She placed her hand back on the burner and held it there while looking straight at our parents. "I forfeit every challenge forever," she said through gritted teeth. "Sophie wins everything from now on." The smell of burning flesh filled the kitchen before Dad finally turned off the stove. Ruby collapsed, her hand destroyed, but she was smiling. She'd found the loophole. If she forfeited forever, I'd never have to live in the shed again. Our parents were furious but couldn't argue with their own rules. Ruby moved to the shed permanently. For 3 months, I lived as their only daughter, while Ruby healed her hand and worked. I snuck her extra food, medicine for her pain, did her chores when they weren't looking. We thought we'd beaten them at their own sick game. Then one night, our parents called me to the living room. "We're dissolving the competition system," Mom announced. "It's become clear that having 2 daughters, even with one as a servant, is diluting our resources." Dad pulled out adoption papers. "We've found a lovely family 3 states away who can't have children. They're willing to take whichever daughter we don't want." My blood went cold. "You can't sell one of us." Mom laughed. "It's not selling, it's adopting. Perfectly legal. We've already had you both evaluated by a social worker who agrees that separation would be best for everyone." She showed me the report, full of lies about how we fought constantly, how our competition had made us dangerous to each other. "So we need you to help us decide. You've lived as our daughter for 3 months now. You know what Ruby's really like. Tell us. Should we keep our winner? Or would the damaged servant girl make a better daughter once she's healed?" I realized with dawning horror what they'd done. Ruby sacrificed her hand to save me, but now they were using that sacrifice against her. A damaged daughter versus a whole one. They showed me photos of the prospective adoptive family. They looked kind, normal, nothing like our parents. Whoever went to them would finally be free. We need to know by morning. I stood there frozen while my parents watched me like hawks waiting for prey to move. The adoption papers sat on the coffee table between us, and I could see the official stamps and signatures already in place. My mind raced through every possible way this could go wrong for Ruby. Mom tapped her foot impatiently, and Dad crossed his arms over his chest. I forced my voice to stay steady even though everything inside me was screaming. I need the night to think about such an important decision. They looked at each other, and something passed between them that I couldn't read. Mom finally nodded and said they'd need an answer at breakfast, 7 sharp. I walked upstairs trying not to run even though my legs wanted to sprint. Once in my room, I locked the door and went straight to the window. I cracked it open just enough to tap our old signal on the glass. 3 short taps, 3 long ones, 3 short again. The shed window opened slightly and I heard Ruby tap back the same pattern on her side. Relief flooded through me knowing she was awake and heard me. I changed into pajamas and got into bed, but sleep was impossible. The smell of Ruby's burning flesh haunted me every time I closed my eyes. I could still see her face as she held her hand on that burner and stared straight at our parents. She'd saved me from ever living in the shed again, but now that sacrifice might send her away forever. The clock on my nightstand showed 11:47 when I finally gave up on sleep. I crept downstairs, avoiding the creaky 3rd and 7th steps we'd memorized years ago. The kitchen computer sat in the corner where Mom could watch us during homework time. I typed the Hamptons' names into the search bar and waited for the slow connection to load. Their Facebook page showed a nice house with a big yard and 2 golden retrievers playing fetch. There were photos from a church picnic where they were serving food to homeless people. Mrs. at Hampton worked as a nurse and Mr. Hampton taught middle school science. They looked genuinely kind in every photo, nothing like the cold faces I saw at dinner every night. I printed 3 pages of their information and folded them small enough to hide. Back upstairs, I pulled out my school bag and dumped everything on the floor. Under my bed was a shoebox I'd hidden months ago with evidence of what they did to us. Old competition lists written in Mom's neat handwriting detailing each monthly challenge. Photos I'd taken on Ruby's phone during her losing months showing bruises on her arms and back. A picture of the shed interior with just a sleeping bag and bucket. My hands shook as I stuffed everything into a folder and buried it deep in my school bag under textbooks. The house was silent as I slipped out the back door at 12:30. The grass was wet with dew and soaked through my socks immediately. I knocked softly on the shed door using our code pattern and heard Ruby moving inside. She opened the door and I saw her damaged hand wrapped in a dirty dish towel that looked like it hadn't been changed in days. The skin around the edges was red and swollen and I could smell infection starting. We sat on her sleeping bag and I pulled her good hand into mine. They're giving one of us away for adoption. Her face went pale, but she squeezed my hand back. The family looks nice, they have dogs and everything. She nodded and said she'd go willingly if it meant I could stay safe in the house. No, you already sacrificed enough. We argued in whispers for 20 minutes about who deserved to stay and who should go. Neither of us could agree because we both wanted the other one safe. Ruby's fever was obvious when I touched her forehead, and she admitted the pain was getting worse every day. I told her about the evidence I'd collected, and she added 2 more photos she'd hidden of burn marks from old challenges. We made a plan to both survive this somehow, even though neither of us knew exactly how. I left the shed at 1:15 and went back inside for a glass of water. Dad was in the kitchen getting a beer, and I froze in the doorway. He asked what I was doing up, and I said I couldn't sleep thinking about the decision. I pulled out my phone pretending to check the time while secretly hitting record. You know this is what's best for everyone, he said. 1 daughter is all we ever wanted anyway. I tried to get him to say more about the abuse, but he just grunted and headed back upstairs. My hands fumbled with the phone and I accidentally deleted the recording while trying to save it. I stayed in the kitchen for another 10 minutes making sure he was really gone. The next morning came too fast, and I had to sit through breakfast pretending to think about my decision. Mom made pancakes like it was a special occasion while Ruby ate cold oatmeal in the shed. They dropped me at the school at 7:45 and reminded me we'd discuss my choice at dinner. I went through first period math and second period English like a zombie. At lunch, I found Miss Aunt Garrison in her office with the door open. She was eating a sandwich and grading papers, but looked up when I knocked. I need to talk about something serious happening at home. She put down her pen and asked me to sit down. I'm scared of what might happen if I tell you. She closed the door and pulled her chair closer to mine. She looked at me with the kind of eyes teachers get when they know something bad is happening, but need you to say it first. I told her about the competitions and how Ruby burned her hand on purpose to save me from the shed. Her face got pale when I described the monthly challenges, and she started writing everything down on a yellow notepad. She asked if Ruby was getting medical care for her hand, and I shook my head because our parents said hospitals ask too many questions. Miss Garrison stood up and paced around her small office for a minute before sitting back down. Sophie, I need to report this, but I want to help you both stay safe. She scheduled another meeting for tomorrow after school, and said she'd think about the best way to handle this. The walk home took forever because I knew Mom would be waiting. Sure enough, she was in the kitchen when I got there and immediately grabbed my phone from my backpack. Why are you 40 minutes late? I told her we had a group project for history and needed to plan our presentation. She scrolled through my texts and call log while I stood there trying not to shake. Write down all your teachers' names and their classroom numbers so I can verify this tomorrow. I got a piece of paper and wrote them all down while she watched over my shoulder. After dinner, I told them I needed to go back to the school because I forgot my math book in my locker. Dad drove me there and waited in the car while I went inside. The library was still open for tutoring, and I signed in with a fake name, then found a computer in the back corner. Mr. Wolf's email was on the original evaluation paperwork, and I typed carefully so I wouldn't make mistakes. I reminded him about his visit 3 months ago when he said we seemed like a happy family. I told him things had gotten much worse and Ruby's hand was infected from the burn she got during a competition. I begged him to look deeper this time and not just believe what our parents said. My hands were shaking, so bad I could barely hit send. Back at home that night, we all sat down for dinner like normal. Ruby came in from the shed to serve the food, and I saw how her face was red and sweaty even though it was cold outside. She barely put any food on her own plate, and when she sat in the corner to eat, she kept closing her eyes like she was dizzy. The dirty cloth around her hand had yellow stains soaking through, and the smell made my stomach turn. Our parents acted like they didn't notice anything wrong. Mom talked about her day at work, and Dad read the newspaper while Ruby struggled to even hold her fork. I wanted to say something, but knew it would only make things worse for her. The next morning, I checked my email at the school and saw Mr. Wolf had already replied. He said he'd schedule a follow-up visit within the week, and was required by law to notify our parents about the visit in advance. My whole body went cold reading that because I knew they'd have time to clean everything up and coach us on what to say. I deleted the email and cleared the browser history 3 times. 2 days later at breakfast, Mom announced that Mr. Wolf would be coming that afternoon for a routine follow-up. You'll both be on your best behavior and answer his questions properly. She made Ruby come in from the shed and they spent an hour going over what we could and couldn't say. Dad went outside and moved all of Ruby's stuff from the shed into the garage storage area. They put gardening tools and old paint cans where her sleeping bag usually was. Mom made Ruby wash her face and put on clean clothes that actually fit. They rewrapped her hand in white gauze so it looked like a normal bandage instead of the dirty rags. She practiced her smile in the mirror while Mom stood behind her giving instructions. You're happy here, and the adoption is a wonderful opportunity for one of you to have new experiences. When Mr. Ed Wolf knocked on the door at 2 o'clock, everything looked perfect. Mom had baked cookies and the house smelled like vanilla. Ruby and I sat on the couch while our parents explained how we'd been having typical teenage problems. Sisters fight sometimes, and we think some distance would help them both mature. Mr. Wolf wrote notes and asked us basic questions about school and friends. Ruby smiled and gave all the right answers while I tried not to look at her hand shaking in her lap. Our parents talked about the Hamptons and what a loving family they were. They have a big house with separate bedrooms, and they're so excited to welcome one of the girls. After 20 minutes, Dad said he needed to get some documents from his office upstairs. Mom went with him, saying she knew exactly where they filed everything. The second they left the room, Mr. Wolf leaned forward and pulled a business card from his pocket. He wrote his personal cell number on the back and slid it across the coffee table to me. His eyes stayed on Ruby's wrapped hand and then moved to my face. Call me directly if you need anything at all. We heard footsteps on the stairs, and he leaned back in his chair just as our parents returned with a folder. They showed him report cards and medical records that didn't mention any injuries. After he left, Mom's fake smile disappeared immediately. The Hamptons can take whichever twin this weekend, so you have 2 days to decide, Sophie. My legs felt weak, and Ruby had to sit down because the fever was making her dizzy again. 2 days to choose who gets a real family and who stays here. The next morning, both our parents left for work at 7:30. I waited 10 minutes to make sure they weren't coming back, then went to Dad's office. The adoption papers were in the top drawer, along with the fake reports saying we were violent with each other. My phone camera clicked over and over as I photographed every single page. The lies were so detailed about fights that never happened, and injuries we supposedly gave each other. My hands shook holding the phone, and I had to retake some pictures because they came out blurry. 20 pages of documents that would separate us forever based on complete lies. I put everything back exactly where I found it and slipped out of the office, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The school day dragged on forever, and I kept checking my phone to make sure the photos were still there. After the final bell rang, I went straight to Missy Garrison's office and knocked on her door 3 times. She opened it and saw my face and immediately closed the door behind me, locking it. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and showed her everything, swiping through photo after photo of the competition lists, the fake reports, Ruby's wrapped hand from different angles. She sat down hard in her chair and covered her mouth with both hands. I told her about the shed, the monthly challenges, how Ruby burned her hand on purpose to save me from ever losing again. Her face went white when I described the stove competition and how our parents made us hold our hands on the burners. She picked up her phone and started dialing before I even finished talking. I have to report this to CPS right now, she said, and I nodded because I knew she would. She talked for 20 minutes while I sat there watching the clock, knowing my parents would wonder why I was late. When she hung up, she wrote down a case number on a sticky note and handed it to me. They'll contact your parents within 24 hours for an initial visit. My stomach dropped because that meant they'd have time to prepare and hide everything. Missy Garrison walked me to the front entrance and squeezed my shoulder before I left. That evening at dinner, the phone rang and Dad answered it with his mouth full of food. His face changed completely as he listened, going from confused to angry to carefully blank. He hung up and looked at Mom. Child Protective Services will be here tomorrow afternoon for a wellness check. Mom's fork clattered onto her plate and they both turned to stare at me and Ruby. Which one of you did this? Mom's voice was ice cold. Ruby shook her head and I kept my face completely still, not giving anything away. They sent us to our rooms, or rather me to my room and Ruby to the shed, while they stayed up late cleaning everything. I heard them moving furniture and talking in harsh whispers about what to say. Around 11, Mom unlocked the shed and shoved Ruby inside without any dinner, assuming she'd somehow gotten help at the school. I waited until 1 in the morning when I knew they were asleep and snuck outside with crackers hidden in my pajama pockets. Ruby's window was cracked open just enough for me to push the crackers through. Her good hand reached out and took them while her burned one stayed hidden in the darkness. The next morning, I left for school early and stopped at Nina Archer's house 3 doors down. She was watering her roses when I walked up her driveway. I pulled an envelope from my backpack, thick with printed photos and handwritten notes about everything that had happened. Can you hold this for me just in case something happens? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She took the envelope, and that's when she saw the bruises on my arms from where Dad had grabbed me the night before. Her eyes went hard, and she nodded immediately, tucking the envelope into her gardening apron. Do you need help right now? She asked quietly. I told her CPS was coming today, but to watch for anyone official looking and let them know about the shed if they asked questions. She said she'd noticed strange things for years, like Ruby doing yard work at midnight or me sneaking food outside. I should have said something sooner, she said, and I could see she meant it. That afternoon when I got home from the school, both my parents were dressed in their best clothes with fake smiles plastered on their faces. The Hamptons are coming for dinner tonight, Mom announced like it was wonderful news. They want to meet both twins before making their decision. Dad added that they wanted the adoptive parents to choose which daughter they preferred, making it look like the Hamptons' idea instead of theirs. My whole body felt cold because I knew this was their backup plan if CPS didn't find anything wrong. The next day at the school, I used the library computer during lunch to log into Mom's email account since I knew her password from watching her type it. I sent a message to the adoption agency asking if the Hamptons could meet me privately at the school first, to discuss the transition without parental pressure. I signed it with Mom's name and deleted the sent message immediately, praying someone would believe it. During PE that afternoon, Ruby looked worse than ever, sweating and pale with dark circles under her eyes. I grabbed her arm and told the teacher she felt faint and needed the nurse. The teacher waved us off without really looking, and we walked slowly down the empty hallway. In the nurse's office, Ruby sat on the paper-covered bed while I explained she'd been dizzy all morning. The nurse took her temperature and frowned at the reading, then noticed Ruby cradling her wrapped hand against her chest. "Let me look at that," she said gently. Ruby tried to pull away, but the nurse was already unwrapping the dirty bandages. The smell hit us first, sweet and rotten, and then we saw the angry red streaks running up Ruby's arm from the blackened burn. The nurse gasped and immediately grabbed her camera, taking photo after photo from every angle. She picked up the phone on her desk and I heard her say the words, "Mandatory medical neglect report," to whoever answered. Ruby started crying and begging her not to call anyone, terrified of what our parents would do, but the nurse was already dialing another number. "I need an ambulance at Jefferson High School for a severely infected burn injury," she said firmly. We could already hear sirens in the distance when someone knocked on the nurse's office door. A woman in a gray suit walked in holding a tablet and a folder with the CPS logo on it. "I'm here about Sophie and Ruby," she said, looking between us. "I'd like to interview you separately if that's okay, starting with Sophie." She led me to a small conference room down the hall, while Ruby waited with the nurse who was still taking photos of her infected hand. The investigator closed the door and pulled out a recorder, but I was already reaching into my pocket for the folded piece of paper I'd been carrying all day with Nina's address written on it. I slid it across the table and told her about the envelope full of evidence I'd given my neighbor to hold, how Nina had seen the bruises on my arms and agreed to keep everything safe. The investigator nodded and wrote down the address, saying she'd send someone to collect it immediately, and that I'd done the right thing by creating a backup of evidence. She asked me questions for almost an hour about the competitions, the shed, the adoption threat, and I answered everything while watching the clock, because I knew my parents expected me home soon. When she finally let me go, Ruby was already being interviewed in another room, and the nurse told me to go straight home so my parents wouldn't get suspicious. I walked home slowly, my legs feeling like jelly, and found Mom in the kitchen already dressed up for dinner with her fake pearls on. She told me the Hamptons were coming at 7 and I better not embarrass them, then sent me upstairs to change into my nicest clothes, which weren't very nice since most of my stuff was hand-me-downs from church donations. Around 6:30, I heard car doors slam and looked out my window to see an expensive sedan in our driveway, with a couple getting out who looked exactly like their photos online. Mrs. Hampton had kind eyes and gray hair pulled back in a bun, while her husband was tall with a gentle smile that reminded me of my old kindergarten teacher. They knocked and I heard Mom's fake, cheerful voice floating up the stairs as she welcomed them inside, already starting her lies about how Ruby was at a friend's house studying for a big test tomorrow. I came downstairs and shook their hands, trying to look normal even though my brain was screaming about Ruby still being at the hospital getting her infected hand treated. During dinner, Mom kept steering the conversation toward what wonderful opportunities the Hamptons could provide for whichever daughter they chose, while Dad sat there nodding like one of those dashboard bobbleheads. Mrs. Hampton asked to use the bathroom halfway through dessert, and I jumped up to show her where it was, my heart pounding so hard I thought everyone at the table must be able to hear it. While she was washing her hands, I pretended to check for towels in the cabinet, and slipped a folded note from my pocket into her open purse sitting on the counter. The note explained about the shed where Ruby had been living, her burned hand from the stove competition, how our parents made us compete for the right to exist, everything I could fit on one piece of notebook paper in tiny handwriting. Mrs. Hampton came out of the bathroom and thanked me, picking up her purse without noticing the extra weight, and we walked back to the dining room together. Dad's eyes locked onto me immediately, and I could see he'd been watching how long we were gone. After the Hamptons left, he grabbed my arm hard enough to leave new bruises over the old ones, and pulled me into the hallway, asking what I'd been talking to them about for so long. I apologized and said I was just being polite, showing her where the hand towels were, and he squeezed harder before letting go with a warning to stop being so friendly with strangers. That night I couldn't sleep, wondering if Mrs. Hampton had found my note yet and what she would do about it. The next morning at the school, Mr. Garrison pulled me and Ruby out of first period, and Ruby's hand was wrapped in clean white bandages now with proper medical tape, instead of the dirty rags from before. She took us to the principal's conference room where 2 CPS investigators were waiting with notebooks and recording equipment. They explained our parents wouldn't be notified about this interview until afterward, since there were concerns about immediate safety, and they needed to document everything while we were in a secure environment. Ruby went first this time while I sat in the waiting area trying to focus on my history homework, but really just staring at the same paragraph over and over. When it was my turn, I told them everything again, adding details I'd remembered since yesterday about specific competitions and punishments. They asked if I had any scars or marks, and I showed them the bruises on my arms plus old scars on my back from when I was 8, and lost a competition so badly that Dad used his belt. The investigators took photos of everything and had me sign papers saying my statement was true. After school, I went straight home like always, but Ruby had to go back to the hospital for another round of antibiotics through an IV. That night, I woke up around 2 in the morning to crying sounds coming from outside and realized Ruby must have gotten home and gone straight to the shed. Her fever was back and I could hear her moaning through my cracked window, the sound carrying across the dark yard. I snuck downstairs to the kitchen and picked up the phone, dialing the hospital number I'd memorized from Ruby's discharge papers. The nurse who answered listened to me whisper Ruby's symptoms, how she was burning up and crying in pain, and said Ruby needed to come back immediately because the infection might have spread to her blood. I heard footsteps on the stairs and hung up quickly, pretending to get a glass of water when Dad appeared in the doorway. He watched me drink the whole glass before going back upstairs, and I followed a few minutes later, praying someone would help Ruby soon. The next morning, I felt genuinely sick from worry, but played it up even more when I got to the school, telling the nurse I was dizzy and might pass out. She had me lie down on the cot and took my temperature, which was normal, but she played along when I whispered that Ruby needed an ambulance sent to our house right away. The nurse picked up her phone and I heard her making a call about a wellness check needed at our address, saying she had concerns about a student's medical needs not being met. I stayed in her office until second period, then went to class, trying to act normal even though my stomach was in knots. Around 10:30, the principal's voice came over the intercom asking for me to come to the office. And when I got there, Mom was standing at the counter with her arms crossed and her face red. She told the secretary there was a family emergency, and she needed to take me home immediately. During the drive, she kept asking what I'd told the nurse, but I played dumb, saying I'd just felt sick and needed to lie down. When we pulled into our driveway, there was already an ambulance there with its lights flashing and paramedics carrying Ruby out of the shed on a stretcher. She was barely conscious and her skin looked gray, her bandaged hand swollen despite the antibiotics she'd been taking. Dad was arguing with the paramedics, saying she was fine and just needed rest, but they ignored him and loaded her into the ambulance. One of them said something about sepsis and organ failure if they didn't treat her immediately. Mom tried to get in the ambulance, but they told her to follow in her car, and I watched them drive away with the sirens screaming. At the hospital, the ER was crowded, but they took Ruby straight back to a trauma room. Dr. Kramer was the attending physician, and he took one look at her hand before ordering blood tests and IV antibiotics. While the nurses kept my parents in the waiting room filling out paperwork, Dr. Kramer examined Ruby more thoroughly and found old scars all over her back and legs, documenting each one with photographs. He asked her directly if someone had hurt her, and she just started crying, unable to speak through her fever and exhaustion. The nurse who was helping him mentioned she'd seen malnutrition cases before, and Ruby's muscle wasting looked similar, so they ordered nutritional panels along with everything else. The blood work came back showing Ruby had sepsis starting, and they rushed her to the ICU while I sat in the waiting room watching my parents pace back and forth like caged animals. Mom kept checking her phone every 30 seconds, and Dad's jaw was clenched, so tight I could see the muscles jumping in his cheek. After about an hour, the automatic doors burst open, and my parents stormed toward the ICU demanding to see their daughter immediately. Dr. Kramer met them at the nurse's station and calmly explained that Ruby was receiving critical care for a severe infection that had spread to her bloodstream. Dad's face turned red, and he started yelling that they were taking Ruby home right now, that this was all a misunderstanding. But Dr. Kramer just stood there with his arms crossed. "She's legally required to stay for observation given the severity of her condition," he said, and I noticed 2 hospital security guards had appeared near the elevators. Mom tried to push past him, but the guards stepped forward, and Dr. Kramer added that any attempt to remove Ruby would result in them being removed from the hospital. While they were arguing, a woman in a gray suit walked up carrying a thick folder and introduced herself as the CPS investigator assigned to our case. My parents went completely white when she pulled out paperwork for emergency protective custody based on the medical evidence and multiple reports she'd received. Mom grabbed Dad's arm, and they both started talking at once about how this was all a mistake, how they were good parents, how the girls were just dramatic teenagers making things up. The investigator just kept writing notes while they talked, occasionally asking questions that made them stumble over their answers. She told them both girls would be placed in protective custody pending a full investigation, and that they'd be notified of the court date. That night after the investigator left, Mom cornered me in the hospital cafeteria where I was trying to eat a sandwich. She slammed adoption consent forms down on the table and told me if I signed them right now, Ruby could go live with the Hamptons, and this whole misunderstanding would disappear. "You're destroying our family over nothing," she hissed, but I pushed the papers back across the table and walked away. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, and when I opened it, it was Mr. Hampton saying he'd found my note in his wife's purse and wanted to help however he could. He asked if there was any evidence he should know about that might help Ruby's case. I called Missy Garrison from the hospital bathroom, and she helped me set up a secure link to send Mr. Hampton photos of all the competition lists I'd saved, Ruby's medical records from the past few months, and pictures of the shed where the loser had to live. Within minutes, he texted back that he was contacting his lawyer immediately and would do whatever it took to help us both. The next morning, Nina showed up at the hospital with the envelope I'd given her and handed it directly to Ms. Garrison, who was there meeting with the CPS investigator. Inside were years' worth of evidence I'd been collecting, including photos of bruises, recordings I'd made on an old phone, and copies of the fake social worker report my parents had created. The investigator spent 2 hours going through everything while taking detailed notes and making copies of each document. Mr. Wolf arrived that afternoon looking pale and shaken, carrying his original report from months ago. He sat down with the investigator and formally revised his assessment, admitting he'd been completely deceived during his initial visit. He documented how my parents had coached us on what to say, how they'd hidden Ruby in the shed during his visit, and how he'd missed obvious signs of abuse because he'd trusted their explanations. He provided written testimony about what he should have seen and promised to testify in court about his failures. 2 days later, a judge reviewed all the evidence and granted a 72-hour emergency hold on both of us. The bailiff explained we'd be placed in separate foster homes while the investigation continued, and even though I felt numb with shock, at least Ruby was finally getting proper medical care. Her foster family lived just 10 minutes from the hospital so she could get daily wound treatment for her hand, which the doctor said might need skin grafts. The first time I visited her, we both just sat there crying, feeling guilty for getting our parents in trouble, but also relieved that we were finally safe from the competitions and the shed. My foster mom gave us privacy to talk, and Ruby kept apologizing for not being stronger, for getting sick, for making everything complicated. I told her none of this was her fault, and that she'd saved me by sacrificing her hand that day on the stove. Our parents started leaving voicemails on both our phones. First angry ones calling us ungrateful liars who were destroying the family, then pleading ones begging us to come home and promising things would be different. The CPS investigator collected all the messages as evidence and told us we weren't allowed any direct contact with them while the investigation continued. She explained that everything would go through official channels now, and that we were both safe from any retaliation. 3 days passed before the Hamptons filed their petition with CPS to become Ruby's foster parents, and since they were already approved for adoption, the agency moved fast on their application. The caseworker called me that afternoon to explain how Ruby would be moving in with them, while I stayed with my current foster family, and even though it meant we'd be separated again, at least she'd be with people who actually wanted to help her. My foster mom sat me down in the kitchen that evening and went over all the house rules, showing me where they kept extra blankets and towels, and which shelves in the pantry were for snacks I could take whenever I wanted. She walked me upstairs to what would be my room, a small space with yellow walls and a twin bed, and pointed to the lock on the inside of the door, telling me I could use it whenever I needed to feel safe, and nobody would ever make me open it if I didn't want to. The next morning, the CPS investigator arrived with a recorder and stacks of forms, and we sat at the dining room table for 3 straight hours. While I told her everything about the competitions, every single month one of us spent in the shed, every test our parents made us take. She wrote down dates and details about the running challenges where we'd collapse on the track, the academic tests they'd create just to watch us fail, the psychological games where they'd say the worst things until one of us broke down crying. Her pen never stopped moving as I described serving dinner to my family while they pretended I didn't exist, watching Ruby through the window hauling trash in the rain, the 5-minute strategy sessions where we'd plan how to throw challenges without getting caught. When I got to the part about the stove and Ruby's hand, she had to pause the recording because her own hands were shaking, and she said in 15 years of doing this job, our case was one of the worst she'd seen. Mr. Wolf showed up at my foster home 2 days later with dark circles under his eyes and a folder full of papers, and he sat across from me in the living room apologizing over and over for missing what should have been obvious signs. He explained how our parents had coached us before his visit, how they'd hidden Ruby in the shed and made everything look normal, how he'd believed their lies about sibling rivalry and never thought to dig deeper. He pulled out his original report and showed me where he'd written that we seemed like a loving family with minor conflicts, then showed me the revised report where he documented all the red flags he should have caught, promising he'd testify in court about exactly how our parents manipulated the system. Mrs. Garrison called my foster mom that week to work out the details of keeping Ruby and me in the same school, even though we were living in different foster homes now. She rearranged our class schedules so we'd have the same lunch period every single day, made sure we were in the same PE class, and even got us lockers next to each other so we'd have those few minutes between classes to check in. The first court hearing happened 2 weeks later in a small courtroom downtown, and our parents sat at one table with their lawyer, while Ruby and I sat with our guardian ad litem at another. The judge reviewed all the evidence, the photos of Ruby's burned hand, the documentation of years of competitions, the testimony from teachers and neighbors who'd noticed things weren't right. Our parents tried to argue that it was all a misunderstanding, that we were exaggerating, that they were just trying to raise strong daughters. But the judge cut them off and ordered supervised visitation only, meaning they could only see us at a CPS office with a social worker watching. He also mandated they attend parenting classes twice a week and individual therapy sessions, and I watched Dad's face turn red while Mom gripped her purse so tight her knuckles went white. Ruby officially moved in with the Hamptons the next day, and I helped her pack the few things she had at her temporary foster home into a garbage bag, since she didn't own a suitcase. Mr. Hampton picked her up in his SUV and I watched them drive away, feeling that familiar guilt even though I knew she was going somewhere good, somewhere she'd finally be treated like she mattered. That first night apart, Mr. Hampton called my foster parents and set up a video chat on his laptop, so Ruby and I could talk, and we spent an hour just staring at each other through the screen, not really knowing what to say now that we could actually have a normal conversation. We talked about homework and which teachers were annoying, and what we'd eaten for dinner, simple stuff that we'd never been allowed to discuss before, and it felt weird but also amazing to just be sisters without any competition between us. My foster parents sat me down a month later and asked about my plans for when I turned 18, whether I wanted them to pursue adoption, or if I'd rather prepare for independent living with aged-out foster kid programs. I told them I needed to focus on the school first and figure the rest out later, and they said that was fine, that there was no rush to decide anything permanent. 2 weeks after that, the first letter from our parents arrived through CPS. 4 pages of Mom's neat handwriting trying to convince us to come home, saying they'd changed. They understood now what they'd done wrong. They just wanted their family back together. The social worker brought it during my therapy session, and my therapist helped me practice saying no, teaching me that I didn't owe them anything, that setting boundaries wasn't selfish, that protecting myself from people who hurt me was actually the healthiest thing I could do. 3 months passed before the big day finally came when Ruby would officially become Ruby Hampton at the courthouse downtown. She called me the night before and asked if I'd come to the adoption ceremony, and I told her of course I would. Wouldn't miss it for anything. The Hamptons picked me up that morning in their SUV, and Ruby was already wearing a new dress they'd bought her, blue with little flowers on it, and she kept touching the fabric like she couldn't believe it was real. We sat together in the back seat while Mr. and Hampton drove, and Mrs. and Hampton turned around to show us the cake she'd ordered that said, "Welcome to the family, Ruby," in pink frosting. At the courthouse, we went through security and found the right room where the judge was waiting with all the paperwork spread out on his desk. Ruby signed her name on each page with her left hand since her right was still healing, and the judge made it official with his stamp and signature. The Hamptons hugged her, and then they hugged me too and Mr. Hampton said I was welcome at their house anytime, that I was Ruby's sister, which made me family too. We went to lunch at a nice restaurant afterward where they let Ruby order whatever she wanted, and she got 3 desserts just because she could. I started track team practice the next week at the school, and it felt good to run, to push my body in a way that I chose instead of being forced. The coach said I had natural speed and asked if I'd been training before, but I just shrugged and said I'd done some running at home. Therapy sessions happened every Tuesday and Thursday after school, and my therapist taught me breathing exercises for when the memories got too strong. She had me write letters to my parents that I'd never send, just to get the anger out on paper instead of keeping it inside. I'd write about how much I hated them for what they did to us, how they stole our childhood, how they made us compete for the right to exist. Some days I'd cry through the whole session, and she'd just hand me tissues and tell me it was okay to feel everything I was feeling. The bookstore job came through 2 weeks later, and the manager showed me how to work the register and organize the shelves by genre and author. It was quiet work, and I liked the smell of new books, and the way customers would ask for recommendations like my opinion mattered. My first paycheck was only $87 after taxes, but I walked straight to the bank and opened my own account with my foster mom helping me fill out the forms. The teller gave me a debit card with my name on it, and I kept taking it out of my wallet just to look at it, proof that I was a real person with my own money. 4 months into our placements, CPS scheduled a supervised visit with our parents at their office downtown. Ruby and I sat on one side of the table while Mom and Dad sat on the other with a social worker between us taking notes. Mom started crying right away, saying we'd destroyed the family, that we'd turned everyone against them for no reason. Dad slammed his hand on the table and said we were ungrateful brats who didn't appreciate everything they'd done for us. The social worker warned them to calm down, but Mom kept going, saying we'd ruined their reputation, cost them their jobs, made them the talk of the whole neighborhood. Ruby grabbed my hand under the table and squeezed hard while Dad pointed at us and said we'd regret this when we were older and alone. The social worker ended the visit after only 20 minutes, and wrote in her report that she recommended no more visits for the time being. Our parents had to be escorted out by security while Mom screamed that we were still their daughters and they had rights. The 5-month review hearing came up faster than I expected, and we all had to go back to court to update the judge on our progress. My foster parents submitted reports about my grades and my job and how I was doing in therapy. The Hamptons brought photos of Ruby's room and her report cards, and a letter from her doctor about how well her hand was healing with proper treatment. Our parents' lawyer argued they'd completed their required classes and deserved another chance, but the judge reviewed everything and shook his head. He extended my foster placement for another 6 months and made Ruby's adoption final and permanent, which meant our parents lost all custody rights forever. They avoided jail time since the prosecutor couldn't prove intent to cause permanent harm, but they had to pay fines and stay away from us. Ruby and I decided to skip the big public ceremony the court offered for finalized adoptions, and instead met at the park near her house, just the 2 of us. We sat on the swings like we used to dream about when we were little and locked in the shed, finally free to just be sisters. Ruby had brought sandwiches she'd made herself in her own kitchen, and I'd brought cookies from the bookstore where I worked. We talked about school and boys and movies and all the normal stuff we'd never gotten to discuss before. As the sun started setting, I pulled out my phone and we took a photo together, both of us actually smiling for real, not the fake smiles we'd learned to put on. Later that night, she texted me the picture with a message that said, "We survived and we're still sisters, and that's all that matters in the end." Looking at that photo on my phone in my own room with a lock on the door, I knew we didn't get some perfect fairy tale ending with everything magically fixed. But we got safety and choices, and a future where we both get to exist at the same time, where neither of us has to disappear so the other can live. And honestly, that's enough for me. And that's the story wrapped up. I'm really glad you joined me because it makes sharing these moments so much more meaningful. Hopefully it added a little joy to your day. Subscribe if you'd like to come back for more.